I've only known Al for about 5 years. And in that time, one of the things, you know, Al, as you know, has probably hiked over every square mile of Siskiyou County. He's, you know, he's climbing the mountains, he's been in the valleys. He also, at one time, was at the bristlecone pine, I don't remember the exact name of the park, but you know, one that's way up high in the mountains and has the bristlecone pines, which is a neat place. If you didn't know that, if you do now. The other thing, I think Al's an amazing artist. He does some amazing things with wood carving. He joined the ceramics class that I had downstairs on Wednesdays, and he's been doing some amazing things. Right now he's working on an Indian portrait, which is pretty interesting. It's really coming along. Is it Sitting Bull?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, which he's doing. But it's turning out really nice. So anyway, with our idea tonight, there's lots of folks here, is Al's going to come up, and the idea is we're just going to talk about, you know, where Al's been, what his adventures been. In clay class, we've had amazing conversations about all the different things he's done and seen. So, Al, would you come on up?
Are you going to sit or?
Well, you can sit or stand, or you can do jumping jacks. It's up to you.
Just don't fall.
Yeah, don't fall off the edge. Okay.
That goes for you too, Mr. Rotator Cuff.
Yeah, okay, all right. So you want to give us a short introduction and go from there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think most people know me, at least the hikers do. Those that don't, my name is Groncki. I graduated from the University of Michigan with a forestry degree in 1951, and originally home in Illinois. But the thing about, I had been studying engineering, and the Navy sent me to the University of Michigan. I had 3 years of engineering, and I found out that Michigan had a forestry school. Well, if any of you have had an epiphany experience, that was for me. I mean, instantly I knew I was no longer an engineer, I was going to be a forester. I made an instant decision, I've never regretted it. And so I graduated, came out here in 1951, and I used to listen to the old timers. We all like to listen to the old timers, tell their stories. And I got to thinking, I said, in 51, see, the Forest Service was started in 05. That was only 46 years. And from 51 till now is 63 years. I'm more of an old timer than some of those guys were at that time. And that's sort of shocking to realize, because I still think a lot of some of those old timers with fabulous stories. One of them was Jimmy McNeil. Jimmy was a warehouseman over here, and just had, matter of fact, quite a few Jimmy stories are in the Siskiyou Historical Society, one of their publications. But the thing about Jimmy was really some raconteur, and he would rattle off names and places and dates just to make your head swim. And one time I talked to another old timer, Tom Bigelow, who was variously forest engineer, forest fire control officer, later Yreka City Councilman. And I said, Tom, how does Jimmy keep all those names and dates straight? And old Tom just smiled, and he says, hey, listen, Jimmy never let a few facts get in the way of a good story. So keep that in mind tonight as I'm talking. radios we had were called SX sets. They were a wooden box about that big. They must have weighed 30 pounds, and maybe 20, but it seemed like 30 anyway. And you used just a wire for an antenna, and you tied a branch around the end of the antenna, and threw it up in the tree, and that was your antenna. And so my experience, I'll tell you about the SX set. I think it was 54 or 5. I had a young forester by the name of Bert Rowe working for me. And Bert lived in a tent on the station. And it was about 7:30 at night, and there was no light in Bert's tent. And I went and checked, and no Bert around. His pickup was not there. His dog wasn't there. So it started snowing and blowing. Snow was coming straight at you. And so I got concerned. I went to see the fire control officer, Fred Wilder, and Fred said, "Oh, don't worry. They're just held up or something." But I was not comfortable with that. I said, they could have one of them could have a broken leg, Bert or Art, the fellow that was with him. I said, I gotta go see if I can find him. So I got another forester by the name of John Murray and an SX set, and we took some grub with us, and we headed out. It's the East Fork of Elk Creek. And I knew the blocks that Bert was going to cruise that day, so I pretty knew where they were going. And so we headed out this one ridge, and we could see signs they had been there that day, blazes and things like that. And we kept shouting, and as well as we could in that howling wind, but we never got any reply. And so this went on all night, and about at daybreak, probably about 7 o'clock in the morning, we broke out on a high ridge, and we got out the SX set, tied a branch around the antenna, threw it up in the tree, and turned it on, and I called down to the Happy Camp Ranger Station, and Fred Wilder got on, and he laughed. And with that laugh, I went from a hero to a chump. Because he said, they just pulled in the driveway, Bert and Art. It was how they stayed that night without a fire and why they didn't answer. And Bert, when I asked him about this, he was very sheepish. He said, I felt so bad about you having to come out and look for me. I just felt, he said, we had a fire, we put it out. I muzzled my dog. I muzzled my dog so he wouldn't bark. And so anyway, they weren't hurt, and I felt good about that. And when I got in about noon, the ranger let me go home and go to bed. So that was my experience with the SX. And very shortly, we got Motorola sets. Big improvement. They were about this big, and they had a handle in the phone that clipped over the top of the handle. And they were a big improvement, but to be honest, they weren't any better than these little handy talkies that the hikers use to talk to each other today, because they're line of sight. And today, you know, with cell phones and satellite communications, it's just such a big improvement. Not too long before my time, a good friend, Ernie Spinks, he said when he started, he was an Indian, lived on the river. When he was 12 years old, he started working for the Forest Service as a runner. That's the way they communicated. And of course, you know, if you read anything about the Civil War, that's the way they communicated also. And shortly after that, they got the SX sets, and it's going on from there. The other big change has been the helicopters. No helicopters. one that came into Sawyer's Bar, and it was piloted by an ex-military pilot. And we were all concerned because there were so many accidents during the Korean War with the helicopters. And I asked this pilot, he said, well, he said, you don't really have to worry too much. We found out what the problem was. He said, it's a matter of keeping your oil clean and your spark hot. And so it's a matter of changing oils often and changing spark plugs often. And so we didn't, to my knowledge, have, well, I'll say one accident. There was a pilot in Fort Jones by the name of Bob Trimble. Bob was an excellent pilot, and he had a Alouette, a French helicopter, which was much more powerful than the old Bells. And I flew with Bob a number of times. Matter of fact, I gave my wife Helen a trip in this Alouette. And, but many of us said that Bob took chances. And he took one chance, eventually, that was his last. And he had been, we had a big fire in '64 at Eagle Peak, just over from Callahan down in Trinity. And Bob had done a lot of flying on that. When that was over, his mechanic gave his Alouette a checkout and found there was a little pin in the rotor assembly there. You know that it's got the big blades here, but then it's got the little rotor that goes around and stabilizes the helicopter. And that pin was very critical. And the instructions from the company were, do not attempt to replace this on your own. Order a new one from the company. Well, Bob was impatient, and he had some high tensile steel that he thought was good enough. And so he had his mechanic manufacture a pin out of that high so-called tensile steel. But the man that had given him his instruction came up, and he wanted to show him around. And slightly illegal, but he flew him into the Marble Mountains, and they went fishing. And on the way out, that pin broke. And he put it in auto gyration, which is trying to slow the spin of the copter. But they landed in a real steep canyon, a lot of timber, and they were killed from head injuries by being bounced around in the cabin. And they didn't wear hard, helmets back in those days. If they had worn what the pilots today wear, they would have survived. Because he did a pretty good job of bringing the copter down. But a little later, I went horseback. It was not too far from Shelby Lake. I went horseback to the site of that crash, and it was just impossible. Steep canyon where he had that crash. When I reported for work in Siskiyou, the ranger was Wes Motelli. Wes had come up the hard way. He was not a forest graduate. He and his dad had also been a ranger. As a matter of fact, there's a ridge to the east of Methodist Creek. It's called Hotelli Ridge. It was named after the family. But Wes was a real good ranger. And one of the things he did with me was a great lesson for me. He took me out, spent a whole day with me, driving around the ranger district and giving me the benefit of his managerial experience and whatnot. And I can remember one of the things he said, young man, he said, you're going to have many jobs in your career in the future. He said, just remember, you manage the jobs, don't let the job manage you. And one of the things I noticed that on Friday, there was an awful lot of traffic in Siskiyou, people coming into the ranger's office, and I couldn't figure that. I guess Robbie Broderick, who was my boss, patch of venison or a peck of apples. And he retired in about 65 or so, and he was replaced by a fellow by the name of Douglas Leeds. And Douglas, of course, Doug didn't have his real estate name, but I just mentioned it because Doug became later a regional forester and eventually associate chief in the Washington office.
Oh, wow.
And he was a great guy. The other technical thing, you know, was the retardant planes. And we didn't have any in those days. But in 1956, there was a fire control officer, Forest Service, in Willows area, Lloyd Hayes, and he noticed that the crop dusters down there were doing, you know, a great job in just taking care of the willow, the wild rice, or tame rice crops and whatnot, and he thought maybe they could be used to drop water on fires. And so he got, it wasn't an easy thing to do. Because they had to do some modifications with the airplanes, and they had to do some training on how they would form and how they would peel off and whatnot. But it worked. And we had a fire up in the Happy Camp. I forget the name slips me right now. South of Happy Camp anyway. And so they called for these crop duster planes to come up. And they come up in formation. It just looked like a World War I movie, you know, all these biplanes coming in. And they had a small airport, they had to peel off one by one and land. And the next morning, the same thing, they took off and formed in formation. And their tanks, I think, only held maybe 150 gallons of water. And, but they would circle, and one would peel off, and they had, Forest Service had a leading lane, would drop water first, or show them where, wouldn't actually drop anything, but would show them how to make the approach, and how to leave, because that could be critical in mountainous country. But they did, they peeled off one at a time, just like World War I aerial combat, and they were very effective. And that led to, of course, more advances, bigger airplanes. First thing they got was borate, and for a long time we called them borate bombers. And eventually borate was too caustic. They went to bentonite, which better. Bentonite was still a little caustic. They went to some other, I can't remember the name of it, but it was not caustic nitrate, it was a fertilizer, made things grow better. And today they're experimenting with, of all things, corn flour. It absorbs an awful lot of water, and when you heat it up, other things, you know, when you cook, it bubbles and whatnot, and so it's apparently maybe one of the things coming into the future. But that was quite a sight. Cruising, big changes, you know, in the way they cruise timber and whatnot. It's all computerized now. The foresters go with their little computerized gadgets and enter their cruise data. They can download it right into a bigger computer and print out programs and do a lot of things that we could. The way we did it, we would take a map, and hopefully if there was a road through the center or the bottom, we would lay out every 10 chains, we laid out a marker for a strip. And then we laid out. It was a 10% cruise. And we would cruise from the top to the bottom of the sail in one chain wide and measure all the trees within that one chain and grade them. And then when we got the cruise done, then it was a winter job to sit and take all of that data, because you had, we had conversion tables. You got so many different boards out of a, say, a 1 saw log, number 1 saw, versus the number 2, versus the number 3, versus the 1 peeler or whatnot. And so you had, what you were computing was the value of that sale. And then you had to compute the cost of getting the timber out. Anyway, it was a laborious process. A little later on, they got a first computer in the regional office, one of the card types, and so we would simply take our data and send it down there. They would convert all of our data into punch cards, run it through the computers, and then give us a printout. And but they even, of course, bypass that now. They can do it with these little handheld devices and get all the information they need. So that was a big, big change. One interesting thing happened. Tom Bigelow, as I mentioned, was a fire control officer, and Tom got a call. He had a lookout on Caulfield Mountain, and the man said, "Tom, get somebody else up here. I'm quitting." And this guy had been up there for a number of years. A valuable man. Tom didn't want to lose him. So Tom got into his Model T and drove down to Happy Camp. Then rode into the Happy Camp. Then he had to get a horse and ride down to Soames Bar and up to Caulfield Mountain. And he went to see this lookout, forget his name. And he said, "You can't do this to me." He says, "You're a good lookout, why would you want to quit?" He said, "Well, I've been looking." He says, "I see where the white man works all his life," he says, "to retire and live like the Indians always live." He said, "So I didn't have to work." He said, "I'm going to quit now and go live like the Indians." So Tom had to get somebody else for Caulfield Mountain lookout. Yes, thank you. Another interesting story. We have a ranger at Happy Camp by the name of Hank Shear. And Hank would invite each of us out to go steelhead fishing with him. And the accepted method of steelhead fishing was to bounce a half-ounce wallow right on the bottom of the river. It was very effective. We caught a lot of steelhead. And but Hank would only take one wallow right. Well, before long, he'd lose that. And pretty soon he'd be borrowing wallow rights from you. And this happened to me, and then we compared notes. It happened to everybody on the station. That's the way he went steelhead fishing. So finally, there's two stories involved here. There was a fellow, Tom Davis, lived down Douglas Creek and had about 12 head of cattle. And in the wintertime, grazing got a little scarce up on the hill. And there was free range, so they came down to the highway into town, grazed wherever they pleased, open range. Well, one of these cows got stuck in the Forest Service cattle guard. And Hank and I was away, thank God. But Hank and a few other people struggled for several hours getting that cow out of the cattle guard. So then, the next morning, I had some steelhead in the smoker, and I went which was right across from the Ranger's house. And I went to check my steelhead, and Larry Smith, the dispatcher, came out, and we were shooting the breeze, and all of a sudden, kaboom, kaboom, and we thought, look, there was the Ranger standing with a smoking double-barrel shotgun. He had just shot one of Tom Davis's cows. He didn't kill it, but he ruined it. And the next day, I was in the office, and the forest supervisor called, and old Hank denied that he had anything to do with it. He didn't. That Tom Davis was crazy. And but Hank was gone in a week because he couldn't hide it. There were too many people that knew. And so we were going to have a going away party for Hank. And a bunch of us got together and we were talking about this wall run thing. I said, he's so damn cheap, not even wanting to buy his own wall. We shouldn't spend any money on his going away party. Well, I had a crew cruising down at T-Bar. So somebody suggested, hey Al, why don't you shoot a couple of them wild pigs down there, and we'll butcher them up, and we'll have a roast pig for Hank's going away party. So I agreed. So John went up, noted Valley artist, was on that crew, and came time to shoot one of these pigs, or two of them. And John and I couldn't agree on how big they should be. I was after little quarters like this, and John thought, oh no, we gotta get something bigger than that. And he had the rifle. Well, finally, he shot two of them, and they went about 100 pounds apiece. And we had to be careful how to call those in, because most of those pigs were earmarked by the local Indians. And so Fred had told us, you got to keep it quiet. And so I told my boss, Sam Hall, I said, Sam, I got plenty of cruise notes. I said, if I call in and ask for cruise notes, the units will signal that you come down and get the pigs. So I called up Sam the next morning, and he came down, and these pigs were gutted out and hanging in the shower stall from the top to the bottom. And old Sam's eye just popped out. He saw how big those pigs were. One was earmarked, one wasn't. But he took those in, and he and Fred butchered them up, and they passed the meat around to all the ladies. And I can still see Hank and his wife Louise talking to each other, trying to figure out why there was so much pork at their going away party. Yeah, Hank went on to bigger and better things. Eventually, his wife was from South Carolina, and so he thought he had a son that was somewhat autistic, and he figured, well, if he could get him to learn to run the farm back in North Carolina, he could take care of himself. But Hurricane Andrew came through and just ruined that farm. And Hank was a bit emotional and sort of excitable person, and it killed him. He had a heart attack and died. And that was the end of that story. Back in those days, everybody wore cork boots. A cork boot is a boot with steel pegs in the soles. And they call them corked, but it's spelled C-A-L-K-E-D, corked. But everybody said corked. And they were great help when you're working in big timber. The amazing thing was I was on a fire, and in the fire camp there was a rock protruding, and somebody with cork boots walked across that rock, and the sparks flew, and minutes later there were little wisps of smoke coming up from the duff. You can actually start a fire with cork boots. boots and stuff if you're not careful. But cork boots went out. I think if you go to Washington State and some of those, you might still find people wearing cork boots. For the helicopters, of course, we used a lot of horses and mules for delivering food to people, to the firefighters and whatnot. And we had a very novel thing. We had these vacuum packs. They were about 3 gallons, I think, maybe 3 or 4. And they could make a stew or something like that and put in those vacuum cans and put them on the mules and haul them into firefighters. And they were a very effective way of getting some good hot food to some people in some bad places. But as ranger, I had 6 mules and 4 horses. 4 of the mules and 2 of the horses were for the trail crew, and then 2 mules and 2 horses for my use. And looking back on the experience I had with Wes Hotelling and his training with me, I thought it would be great to give each of my foresters at least a week in the mountains, learning how to ride and pack, and learning something about range management and trail maintenance and telephone maintenance and some of those things. And so I did it. Each trip I took a young forester with me. And the hardest job, I think, was having them get rid of their hard hats. Like they're working in the woods, they always wore hard hats. And here they'd show up for a trip into the mountains horseback with their hard hats. And of course, you drop a hard hat on the trail, you might have a little rodeo. And I had a couple rodeos in the mountains myself. I had a little Arabian horse. He was a fine-looking horse, but he had been on the Gooseness District in a wired corral, and the helicopter pilot chose to land right next to him. And he went crazy. He busted through that corral. He had 3 big cuts across his chest. And he was spooky after that. He was a good horse, but he was spooky. And I was riding up the North Fork one time, and I had passed the trail crew, and the trail foreman had a dog. And we probably left them a couple miles behind. We came to a stream crossing, and I was getting ready to cross the stream, and this foreman's dog ran under my horse. But immediately we had a rodeo, and he bucked 3, 4, 5 times, and I stayed with him. And but after he settled down, I thought, well, I better get off and wade this stream. And so I took my right foot out of the stirrup, and at that time he chose to buck again. And I flew through the air and landed on the back of my neck and did a somersault. And when I came up, I looked. Big rock here, and there was a big rock here, and I lit right in between. If I'd been 1 foot either way, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. That same horse, later on that season, we were up, there's a trail that goes from Grant's Meadow over to Shelley, and we were on that trail. Pretty steep country. It was probably 60% grade trail going through it. And I was with the forest supervisor and the deputy, and their horses went across a tree that was over the trail. And I tried to get my horse to follow this little red Arabian, and he wouldn't. So I had spurs on him. I spurred him and forced him to go across that little log. And right when we had another rodeo.
Wow.
Some of them were murders. Probably more of them were logging accidents. I personally saw two of those. One, this fellow, fairly young fellow, married with 3 young kids, fell this big Douglas fir, and he didn't cut it clean. He left some holding wood, and when it twisted, and it put a lot of strain in that upper end of that tree. And when he went, he stood on the uphill side, like steep country. He couldn't stand on the downhill side. He stood on the uphill side, and when he made that first bucking cut, well, all that tension in the log tree just slammed him into the hillside and crushed him. Another one I was privy to was choker setter. Trying to get chokers around some of those big logs was difficult. Sometimes they'd have to get a shovel or sometimes even a little dynamite to blow a hole where they could pass the choker around and set it. But again, you know, we're talking steep country all the time. And this choker setter put the choker around this big log and stood beneath it. And then when the cat came to get the log, when he pulled it tight, the log rolled right over this choker setter. And another accident, there was a couple that went in the river. The lady swam ashore, but her companion got swept downriver. So they sent an airplane to scout the river, and the airplane was flying the river, and apparently both of them were looking and nobody was flying the airplane. And they hit a cable over the river and they went in. So 3 people died in that incident. So all told, there were a lot of violent deaths there happened in those years. And the modern fire organization is something I don't really know much about. The old organization there was a fire boss. Everybody reported to him. He had a line boss that was in charge of all the activities on the fire line. Under the line boss, there were division bosses, then sector bosses, and then crew bosses. I had gotten up to be a division boss. And he also had a plans chief. And I also became a plans chief. I was both rated as a division boss or a plans chief. And one of the early, talking about technology again, in some of those early fires, we didn't know where the fire was. After it was smoked in, you knew where the flanks were, and you were sending crews up, but you didn't know where the head of the fire was. And I was on a fire on the San Bernardino, and all of a sudden, somebody, I think it was military, plane came in with an infrared facility, and took me up in the plane, and we could look through the smoke and see where the fire was. And it was amazing. And I had a map with me I could transcribe onto that map, and it was a great, great sense of relief that we really knew where that fire was at that time. And so then you can do some intelligent planning. Today, with the modern technology, you know, that's not a problem. With the satellites and other types of activities they have, why, it's just not a problem. What I want to finish up with is there's a great deal of difference between the Forest Service I knew back then and the Forest Service today. And what constitutes, I think the biggest cause of that difference was what we call esprit de corps. Some organization did a study of the various government organizations, and in San Francisco wrote a paper about this. And it was his idea that was contributed time that built a structure called the Esprit de Corps. And because we donated an awful lot of time back in those days, nobody watched the clock. There was so much travel time that we made it a policy that all employees would at least travel half of the time on their own time. So if you were going to travel 2 hours, 1 hour in, 1 hour back onto a job, one of those hours would be contributed time. And it worked. When I was ranger, at 7:30 in the morning, all the crews were loaded and out the gate. And they didn't get back until 5:30 in the evening, so there was an hour there of contributed time. But what ruined that was one of these employees, nothing to do with me, I don't know where it happened or what, but he had an accident, a disabling accident, at say 6 in the evening. And it went through the courts. And the courts ruled that he was not entitled to his disability because he was not on approved overtime. So that, right then and there, that one decision ruined all this donated time. I had been in San Francisco and I came up to Sawyer's Bar on a hunting trip. And I'd been out and I came to a log across the road. And I didn't have a saw with me, so I'll just go back to the ranger station and get somebody with a saw and open this thing up. And I got back to the ranger station. As I mentioned before, 7:30, everybody was out the gate. Here it was 7:45. There wasn't a soul around. At 8 o'clock, as if somebody rang a bell, the doors opened and everybody came out holding their lunches. That was the new Forest Service. And there was another thing that affected it was that in my day, everybody in the Forest Service fought fire. I mean, you didn't have an option. You worked for the Forest Service, you fought fire. It may not be on the line, it may be in camp, or it may be as a clerk or something, but you fought fire. Today, that is not true. That didn't go through the courts. I think the Civil Service Commission ruled on that and said it was slightly illegal. That fighting fire might be in the job description, but it had no provision for everybody. There were a lot of people that did not have that in their job description. So those two things made a vast difference in the esprit de corps in the Forest Service, and it's just not the outfit it used to be. But it's still a great outfit. So if any questions, well, I'd be glad to take any questions anybody has.
About the flood at Sawyer Farm when you were there.
Pardon me?
Tell us about the flood at Sawyer Farm when you were there.
Yeah, the 60. I was at Happy Camp in the 55 flood. That was the 100-year flood. And the one when I was at Sawyer's Bar was the 200-year flood. And I had just come back from Washington, D.C., where I had been interviewed by Sergeant Schreiber for the Job Corps program. When Kennedy first started the Job Corps program, he hired his brother-in-law, Sergeant Schreiber, to run it. Of course, and later, a few months later, Kennedy was assassinated, and Johnson took over. But Schreiber thought he would staff all these Job Corps centers with political appointees, buddies of his. And he thought they would be GS-15s. Well, I don't know if you know the government wage structure. But he was told, no, that can't be, because most forest supervisors were GS-13s, and these center directors were going to be 12s. And so you can't make them 15s. So of course, his political buddies were not interested in GS-12 wages. But anyway, I had been in its training session at Camp David, no less, and came back, and the day after I got back, it started raining and snowing. And that was the start of the flood. We were up all night long. The river was rising, and all the bridges went out. Every single little bridge between Sawyer's Bar and Yreka was out. And so we were stuck there. And they made me Red Cross representative, they made me civil defense representative, and Red Cross representative. And the bad thing was there were 80 helicopters down in Yreka, and they were almost all military. None of them would fly. But we had one guy from Ketchikan, Alaska, by the name of Bob Young. And they sent Bob Young over. And I got to know Bob real well because he lived with Helen and I for a week. And we fed him and housed him. And I flew with him up and down the river checking on everybody. And I really came to appreciate the resilience of those people on the river. But just not one of them hollered for help. They were all just, they had enough grub and enough propane and everything else, and they were just satisfied where they were. And old Phil Schwartz, he lived across the river on the swinging bridge, and we stopped and landed and talked to him, and he wasn't concerned about it. Oh, I'll build another bridge. Phil even had a washing machine that was run by water, and he had a pond for his gold mining, and whenever he needed water, he just opened his little gate and ran down into a pipe and threw his little washing machine, and it worked like a charm. But one interesting thing that happened after we'd been up all night, that first night of the flood, our bridge went out. We had a beautiful swinging bridge across the Salmon River, and our water came down from Jessup's Gulch underneath the bridge, and through a Pelton wheel we got 2.5 kW. We had just enough power to give us lights and radio, and but we lost that. So about 11 o'clock or so, we decided, 5 of us, we would go in and rescue that Pelton wheel out of this little shack sitting on sort of a rocky bluff over the river. And after we worked on it a while, somebody said, look we've been up all night, we're hungry, why don't we knock off and go and have lunch early? And we agreed to that. And when we got out of the little shack, we went up on the bank, we stood there for a while watching, and logs would come down the river, and it would hit that bluff where the Pelton wheel was in the shack. And the water would surge up, and the logs would sort of go with the surge and around, and countless, one after another, would do that. All of a sudden, for whatever reason, one log came, and it didn't go with the surge. It went shot straight through, went right through the middle of that shack, took the Pelton wheel off the cement foundation. Nobody ever found it again. If we had remained working on that, I think several men probably would have been killed. Some of us maybe hurt. But that was Providence. And later, I think we were there. Then on top of the flood, we got 3 feet of snow. And thank God we had Bob Young bringing us whatever supplies we needed. But we had a store there, and so as Red Cross director, I told the storekeeper came time, I was being, as I mentioned, I was going to the job corps. And it came time for me to leave. And here my Jeep and dog and cat, my 2-year-old daughter, and but Bob Young flew us out. He flew our baggage and the dog out first. Then they came out, got Helen and I and the baby, and flew us up and landed in Callahan. And the forest supervisor was there waiting for us. The witness getting ready to send me down to my new job, which is at Willows, the Mendocino Forest, running a job corps camp there. So that was my 64 flood experience. And we finally got in April. That was January, first part of January. April, we got in there to get our belongings and our cat.
Oh, wow. Was the cat still there?
The cat was still there. His name was Horatio. Any other questions?
You had talked one time about an Indian that lived out on the river who was very smart, and I can't remember what it was he made now, but I thought that was a very interesting little tidbit.
Ernie Spinks. Sally Johansson knows Ernie Spinks. My friend Paul Salfrank knows Ernie too. Ernie, several people have asked me to write a book. If I write a book, I think it's going to be about Ernie. Ernie was a near genius with a sardonic sense of humor. And we'd be working in the woods, and chain was two chains long, which is 130 feet or so. And he'd wait for me to get up to where he was taking the notes. And then he'd say, "Hey, white boy, what do you call that second log in that second tree?" And he was so good, he could spot. We had graded the logs, and I missed a cone or something, so I had to go back and look. And sure enough, he'd be right. Ernie could do many, many things. When we were in Orleans together, and the ranger said, "Gee, it'd be great if we had a welding machine." And but he couldn't run a welding machine off of 110. And Pete Dutz, as far as PG&E came with their line, was to Orleans. And Ernie just looked at the ranger and said, "You want a welding machine? I'll make you a welding machine." And he said, "This is what I need. I need some parts out of the Model T and some other parts out of the Model A and whatnot." He made an electric arc welding machine. And also he could design roads and survey on roads. And he could take sunshots and establish longitude. And I asked Ernie, I said, "Ernie, where in the world did you learn to do that?" He said, "Well, I was working with an engineer and I saw him do it. And I looked over his shoulder to see what he was doing." He wasn't taught. He learned by watching what this engineer was doing and learned how to take sunshots and establish longitude. And, but he had a tremendous sense of humor. He eventually went to scaling. And the reason we wanted to put it in timber as a timber management system, but he knew that that was strictly a 40-hour job. Whereas if he scaled, he got a lot of overtime, and he could make more money. And he did. He made more than the ranger. But he knew he was going to be check scaled. And my friend Paul Frank there was a check scaler, but it was a guy by the name of Buck that came from the regional office going to check scale Ernie. So Ernie comes out barefoot. Well, immediately the red flag. "You can't climb around these logs barefoot." Ernie says, "My ancestors have been doing it for centuries." What do you mean you're telling me we can't walk around in the woods barefoot? So he didn't, he refused to put on his boots, and he got check scaled, and of course he was right on the money. But that's just some of Ernie's sense of humor. But he was, there are a lot of stories, I can't think of all of them, but many stories about Ernie. Anything else?
Al, what was it like being a family in those days?
Pardon me?
What was it like being a young family out in the Ranger days?
What was it like being a young family in those early Ranger days?
Great. Well, you know, my wife enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was a great opportunity. But eventually they closed that Sawyer station because they couldn't get people to go in there. And I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it. I just thought it was such a marvelous opportunity to, you know, if you're a forester and you love the woods, I mean, what more could you ask? But, yeah, there's some of the ladies who didn't like even handicap, as you well know, Sally. Any other questions?
Mr. Rocker Al, did you know my dear friends Winnie and Al and George Nelson?
Did you know his friend, I think it was...
Winnie and George Nelson.
Winnie and George Nelson?
I'm sure you did.
No.
Really?
Let's come back to me anyway. Sorry. Any questions? Yes?
Now, did you work for the Job Corps? Was that a part of the Forest Service?
Did you work for the Job Corps, and was that part of the Forest Service?
The Job Corps was run by a number of agencies. Each camp, say the Forest Service, had about 28 camps. And so the center director, which I was at one time, had two bosses. The forest supervisor was his boss for running the center facilities and whatnot, and the pay and that sort of thing. But as far as running the educational institution and discipline and that sort of thing, that was up to OEO, the Job Corps program. And after I had been a center director for a while, I was offered a job as a field supervisor for OEO. And I turned it down at first because there was no re-entry agreement between the Forest Service and OEO. But eventually they cranked one out. And so I took the job, and I was located in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, and I had 2 centers in Wisconsin and 2 in Michigan. They were all Forest Service centers. The other agencies that had centers were the National Park Service, Soil Conservation Service, Fish and Wildlife Service. I think that's it. Park Service and Forest Service were the 2 big ones. The others had some, but not as many. But anything else? If not,